Introduction. New York smelled of water and iron. From the Hudson came a damp breath, and the subway exhaled now and then through its grates. A warm, ozonic gust like the sigh of some creature living under the streets. I was walking up Fifth Avenue toward the library with the stone lions, and in the rain those lions seemed to narrow their eyes at me. Patience and fortitude, two words that fit the city like a tailored suit. The lobby was nearly empty. The clock above the coat room was counting down the last minutes before closing, and the attendant was already nudging the stragglers along. I asked for 10 minutes, just enough to pick up a folder of late 19th century block plans I'd requested. They handed me not a folder, but a neat cardboard box the color of dusty parchment. On the lid, in faded ink, A City of Rooms. I didn't recall any record by that title in the catalog. In the reading room, a turning page is louder than any newspaper. I sat beneath a green lamp and lifted the lid. Inside was a slim book and a coarse cloth cover, and in a separate sleeve, a map. At first I took it for another tour's plan of Manhattan, but the shoreline was oddly jagged, as if a child had cut the island out with dull scissors. In the margins sat brief pencil marks, short, confident dashes like sutures. When I ran a finger along the lower edge, the paper gave off the smell of resin and salt wind, the scent of an old pier. On the flyleaf was a line in a steady hand. A city as time folded into stone. No signature, no date. Beneath the line, the cardboard had a narrow slit, a hidden pocket. My fingertips met something dense and cold. I drew it out. A small brass watch, its crystal hairline cracked. There were no numerals on the face. Around the dial stood miniature silhouettes of facades. A pediment, an arch, a crenellated little tower, the clean rectangle of a modernist block, then the sharp, triangular ears of a skyscraper, and at the end something smooth as a leaf. I wound the watch. It didn't tick so much as whisper, the faint hush of a crane shifting a block from one height to another. The hand trembled and came to rest on the arch, somewhere between pediment and tower. I smiled, a designer's trinket, a gift for a lover of cities. But why hide it in a library, in a book's secret sleeve, where every slip of paper requires two signatures? I put the watch down and unfolded the map. On the reverse, among the water stains, a hair-fine drawing lurked, a waterfront, wooden houses, a crude palisade, people hurrying along it in broad-brimmed hats. Above it, a caption, New Amsterdam. I traced the letters. The paper cooled beneath my finger. 5 minutes to close, the attendant said pleasantly behind me. Please pack your materials. I nodded, but didn't rush. The watch found my palm again, its weight certain, like a mason's hand setting a first stone. I turned the crown without any plan, and the hand slipped to the pediment, the oldest of the little shapes. The whisper inside grew a shade louder. From deep in the room the ventilation moaned at length, and for a foolish instant I thought not of ducks, but of masts, straining in wind. There are people who treat buildings as scenery. I'm made otherwise. To me, facades are letters posted to wind and time. I had come to New York for those letters, to collect the stories of Brooklyn stoops, count the rhythms of cornices, write down how a street's voice changes with the angle of approach. Somewhere along the way, the city stopped being chaos and became a text, just a very long one. Perhaps in the same instant I thought that the city decided to write back. I looked again at the map. The coastline seemed to move, only a shade, like a cloud shadow. I blinked. Everything stilled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the paper was alive, like skin. 2 minutes, the attendant called, sharper now. I stood to return the box and noticed a slip tucked between the book's pages. On it, in black ink, "Turn toward the past if you're not afraid of heights." Someone's joke, I thought. My heart answered differently, with a quick, hard knock. I had always been afraid of heights, or rather loved them from a safe remove. Skyscrapers attract the way cliffs do. I sat again, inhaled, and caught scents that hadn't been there a minute before. Tar, wet timber, the smoke of something damp. The watch's whisper settled into a steady gait, as firm as a crew steps on scaffolding. The hand held to the pediment and wouldn't budge. If I'm honest, I almost always do things properly. Proper forms, proper footnotes, proper deadlines. But sometimes the city needed another version of me, the one who leaves the main road for a narrow lane not yet laid. That lane lay now between two layers of cardboard. I set my palm on the map. The paper was cool and springy. For a breath, the lamps seemed to dim, and the white marble of the table turned gray, as if veiled by a sail's shadow. Far off, a gull cried. Inside the watch came a tiny tek-tek, louder this time, as though stones laid centuries ago were speaking their names, one by one. "We're closing," the attendant said. "Please." I looked up and saw her already by the doors. No one stood near me. No one saw what I did next. With thumb and forefinger, I wound the crown to its stop, as if turning a hidden windrose. The hand leapt once more, and for a blink the arch on the dial became a scrap of rough wood pinned by a blacksmith's nail. The room filled with a scent of sea, not curated, but real, bitter with weed and the tarry sweetness of hulls. The floor quivered. The hum of the air system deepened into the low drone of a boat shouldering at a pier just out of sight. I blinked, and the white ceiling dissolved into beams. My palm on the table met not marble, but coarse board. A draft I hadn't felt before brought a Dutch G, thick and honeyed, to my ear. I had time to think, this is impossible, and a second voice inside the thought answered, cities have always been impossible. I glanced down at the map. The ink of New Amsterdam had spread as if under fresh rain. I raised my eyes, and the lions at the entrance were no longer lions, but a timber gate. Dogs barked beyond it. Geese clamored. A boy hunched over a barrel waved at me as if I were returning from a long voyage. The watch in my hand kept perfect time. Its whisper braided itself to the slap of water. I drew a fuller breath, took a step, and crossed into the city's first house, where the walls still smelled of forest and the future was a rectangle of clean, unlined paper. Chapter 1. New Amsterdam, 17th century. The first sound was water-slapping pilings, then gulls, then the hollow thud of barrels rolled across planks. I stepped off the threshold of the library and onto a wharf stitched from rough boards, each one furred with splinters and salt. The river, wider and wilder than the Hudson I knew, threw up a wet breath full of resin and fish. To my left, a ship's hull curved like a rib cage. To my right, a knot of men in broad hats argued about a load of beaver pelts as if the fate of a continent clung to those damp bundles. Before me, the settlement rose, not so much a city as a thought about a city. The houses were low and close set, roofs pitched steep against the weather. Some were timber frames filled with wattle and daub. Others wore thin brick skins the color of dried apricots. Several facades had stepping gables, little stairways cut against the sky as if the rooftops themselves were learning to climb. Doors sat high above the churn of mud, reached by short wooden stoops that lifted people out of the street as if manners were a kind of architecture. At the back of all this stood a wall, not stone, but a palisade of upright logs dark with pitch, running like a coarse seam along the north edge of the settlement. Beyond it, forest. Close, indifferent, waiting. A gate sat open, and through it a cart rattled in, wheels banded in iron. The driver tipped his hat without looking at me. The watch in my palm whispered steadily. Its hand rested on the little pediment. I slid it into my pocket, and the whisper laid itself against my pulse. A boy who might have been the twin of the one waving from the barrel at the library gate now stood in front of me in the flesh, barefoot, a salt line on his shins. "You come on the Prince's?" he asked in a Dutch, tinted with something sandy and local. Then, answering his own question, "No." "You come on your own feet. That is the more curious boat." "I'm looking for the carpenter," I said in English. I tried the word in Dutch, too, the kind my books had taught me, careful and round. He grinned. "We have many." "Which one?" "The one who builds houses that outlast their builders," I said, and the boy shrugged as if that described all of them or none. "Follow," he decided, as if granting me a small favor, and set off at a trot. We crossed a street that was more channel than road. Boards had been thrown down, making a hummocked path. Women with skirts hitched to their knees washed pots at a trough where brown water shivered. Chickens pecked at anything lighter than a nail. A man in a leather apron planed a beam, shavings falling in curls like pale fish scales. Smoke from a dozen hearths lay in thin sheets. The boy ducked under a brace pole and brought me to a house frame. 2 stories worth of posts and beams pinned with wooden pegs, a skeleton with its joints showing. A man stood on a ladder, mallet in hand. He had the shoulders of someone who'd asked trees difficult questions and been answered. His beard was white and trimmed close, his sleeves rolled up, and his hat sat on a peg like a second head waiting its turn. "Master Klaas," the boy called. "A stranger with strange Dutch." The man came down the ladder and looked at me the way a mason looks at a cracked lintel, not unkindly, but alert to failure. "You're not from Brooklyn," he said, "and not from Harlem, nor from any of the places a man would name if he were teasing." "No," I said, "from a city that is here and not here." "Good," he said after a moment. "Then you owe no one favors." "What do you want?" "To learn how a city begins." Klaas tossed the mallet from one hand to the other, weighing my answer. "With knees," he said finally, and pointed to where 2 beams met in a clean mortise and tenon joint. "A house stands on its joints, a city on its meetings. Get those right and the rest can be patched." He let me walk with him through the skeleton. He showed me where the anchor beams would poke through the front, proud and squared, to hold the facade steady. He slammed a peg home, and the frame answered with a sound like a distant drum. He spoke of winter winds coming off the water, of snow that turned alleys into channels, and summer lightning that would take a roof in one quick bite if you gave it dry fodder. He talked about brick, good brick from home, sometimes used as ballast and saved like gold, and about the clay here, too sandy, too stubborn, but learning if you taught it long enough. He set his palm against the post, and I did the same. The oak felt young, as if it hadn't yet made up its mind to become a wall. "Why the stoops?" I asked, watching a woman climb up with an armful of laundry. "Because the street floats and sinks," he said. "Because in spring the channel there," he pointed to a water course running down the middle of the way, "swells until fish think they own it. Because a door that steps up is a door that lasts a season more." I told him I liked the stepped gables. He snorted. "Those are for people who think the sky is a shelf. See there?" He nodded up to a neighboring house where a gable climbed in brick stairs, each step capped with a little finial. "Proud as a rooster, fine until the wind picks him clean." "Then what would you build?" He shrugged. "A roof that knows what weather is, wood that understands water, a hearth that draws well and leaves no smoke in the baby's lungs. In time, he flicked a glance at the palisade. Stone. But stones must come on ships, and ships come for beaver, not for your comfort. A small procession passed us. 3 Lenape men in shirts of woven fiber, carrying a bundle of pelts that made the air musk-sweet and sour at once. One had a string of shell beads running from wrist to elbow, white and purple, a rippling code I couldn't read. They did not look at me. Their eyes slid past to a trader waiting at the end of the street, his mouth already forming numbers. Klaus followed my look. "We trade," he said quietly. "We say friend and then we count. That is also a joint, the kind that makes a city stand, or not." "Does your house remember the forest?" I asked. "All houses do," he said, and thumped the post. "The trick is to persuade it to remember decently." He took me inside another finished dwelling, a neighbor's, door unlatched as if privacy was a luxury saved for richer times. The floorboards were wide and uneven, the hearth big enough to sit in. Delft tiles framed the firebox, little blue ships and windmills in a row like children practicing straight backs. Above the door, a beam ran with a carving I couldn't fully parse. A tulip, maybe, and an animal that might have been a beaver or a dog, and the numbers 1 to 6 to 5 to 3 caught in a rope border. A sourdough smell lived in the air, and something stewed with onions. "Will this stand for 100 years?" I asked. "If God stops leaning on it with his elbow, yes," Klaus said. "If the owner doesn't decide he wants a wider room and forgets about the knee." He tapped the diagonal brace again. "Men like wide rooms the way they like easy oaths." We stepped back into the street, and a gust threw grit against our faces. The watch in my pocket fussed for attention. I pressed my hand to it through the cloth, and it settled. We walked toward the palisade. At its foot, a ditch filled with stagnant water tried to breed a new kind of mosquito. The logs were shaved to points, and where the gate's hinges gnawed the wood, the grain showed like tendons. "Who are you keeping out?" I asked. A child's question. I heard it that way myself. "The wind," Klaus said. "The wolves we haven't seen this winter. Men with hunger and maps. The future. If it has poor manners," he smiled without mirth. "We keep it out until we need it. Then we open the gate and pretend we invited it." We crossed a narrow bridge over the canal that ran along the center of the street. Women emptied buckets into it as if that was the destiny of all water, to receive what people were done with. A fish flipped, astonished to be a citizen. A windmill turned lazily on a rise. Not a picturesque emblem, but a plain piece of work, grinding grain for bread that would be eaten with pickled cabbage and a little beer. "Tell me something," I said. "If you could leave a message for the people who will live here, after you, what would it be?" Klaus considered. He was not a man to give words away without charging them rent. "Do not build a house that hates the street," he said at last. "A door is a promise. Keep it." He left me then with a nod as if to say that questions were good, but beams didn't raise themselves. He climbed the ladder, and his mallet began again, a heart outside a body. I walked alone. The settlement narrowed and opened like a throat. In one place, a tiny garden, cabbage, a brave rose bush staked against pity. In another, men squatted on their heels playing at throwing bones into a chalk circle, their laughter low and easy. A woman beat wool against a post and sang to measure the blows. The song had a tune I almost knew from another century. At the edge of the water, a rock shelf jutted. Oyster shells lay in drifted piles like fistfuls of moons. I squatted and picked one up. It stank of brine and lasted dinners. A man in a cap boiled them in a black pot, and sold them for small coins to anyone whose mouth watered. "Eat," he said. "You look like someone who forgot to." I ate. It tasted of tin and frost and the line between hunger and not. I watched a ferry push off toward the opposite shore, where the trees were thicker and the air looked greener. Someone called the place Breukelin. The name went through me like a bell struck a long way off. The watch's whisper rose a notch. I drew it out. On the dial, the little pediment seemed less an idea than a doorway with light behind it. The hand quivered, not out of uncertainty, but like a dog about to be loosed. I held it flat on my palm. A woman stopped beside me, eyes on the watch, not on me. "That is a serious toy," she said in Dutch. She wore a cap and an apron smeared with white, as if flour wanted to be remembered on her clothes. "It is more serious than I am," I said. She nodded. "Then listen to it. A city is used by the living, but it belongs to the dead and to the unborn. Your toy sounds like a dead man's plan." She considered me. "Or an unborn one's." "Which do you think I am?" "Foreign," she said, and smiled as if that solved everything. "Foreign is a time as much as a place." She left with a loaf under her arm, and I felt the sudden weight of everything that would be built here, and all the hands that would meet and part in the joints of walls. My mouth tasted of oyster and smoke. Somewhere a hammer struck 3 times, then again. The wall creaked. The gate sighed. The river lifted and set itself down. I walked back toward Klaas's frame and stood again with my hand on the oak. I tried to feel the future in it, but what I felt was steadiness. The city would go up and fall and go up again. It would swap wood for brick and brick for steel and steel for glass. And glass, for whatever comes after the word glass grows tired. But under the fashions, the need would still be there, the habit of meeting well. I closed my fingers around the watch. For a second I imagined leaving it here, tucking it into the beam, a seed with a clock inside, to be found by someone whose hands were stained with lime. But the watch pulsed like a bird. It wanted to fly forward, and I wanted, God help me, to see how high the arched doorway of time would lead. Across the canal, a man with a peg leg strode past, his step sharp as punctuation. People made way without looking. He didn't glance at me. He didn't need to. Authority knows itself. I felt the gears in the watch align with something in his raven-quick movement, and then the hand moved, a clean click, away from the pediment toward the next little shape on the dial, the arch. The air thickened for a breath as if a storm had changed its mind. The light shifted from pewter to brass. A distant noise, like ropes paying out through gloved hands, became the clatter of hooves on stone, the rush of more voices, the ring of metal on metal, tall and dense. I looked once more at the palisade, at the stepping gables, at the canal in the street that believed it was still a stream. The boy who had found me waved again. Only now he was older, or maybe just farther away, and then the watch took the rest of the distance and folded it into itself. The wharf fell backward into paper. The gate turned to ink. The smell of tar became the smell of coal and hot iron. I kept my feet under me and listened to the watch whisper, "Come upstairs." Chapter 2. The Brick Skin, 19th Century. Coal smell, iron noise, hooves on stone. The world arrived with weight. I stood in a street that had decided to be a street and not a river, its center paved with cobbles that held the rain like 1,000 cupped hands. Gas lamps planted their small suns along the curb. An omnibus lurched past, its roof crowded with hats and shawls, and a bell clanged somewhere not far, metal speaking in short sentences. The houses rose at ranks, shoulder to shoulder, a warm procession of browns and russets. The skin of the city had turned to stone, not marble, not granite, something softer, sweeter, sugar brown, and faintly porous. Stoops lifted up from the mud to the parlor floors like long inhalations. Iron railings curled into leaves. Newel posts wore acorn caps. Window lintels thickened into eyebrows. Cornices flung out shadows like brims of serious hats. The air held laundry steam, horse sweat, bread, and a little ocean for honesty. The watch lay in my palm, whispering, its hand set to the arch. Compression's trick, it seemed to murmur. Weight that holds itself up. I climbed a stoop and paused beneath a stone lintel where shallow carvings made a city of shadows when the light came right. A woman in a flour-dusted apron scrubbed the top step, sleeve rolled past the elbow, ring catching the gray daylight. "Careful, sir," she said, though I had not yet moved. "Men fall in love with stoops and never make it to the door." "Is that a warning or a blessing?" "Depends on the neighborhood," she said, and flicked dirty water into the gutter, where it joined a parade of other household decisions headed down the street. Inside these houses, behind doors thick with varnish and promises, a room floated slightly above the city. Parlor, piano, a pier mirror catching a chandelier twice. On the garden level below, the kitchen breathed. The coal bin sighed. A small boy counted stove plates as if they were planets. A brownstone is a belief as much as a building, that the family can sit one story above the street and still hear it well enough to belong. At the corner, a carriage disgorged a man with a portfolio. His collar was correctly starched, his eyes correctly hungry. "Pattern books," he said to the vendor under the awning without preface. "The new ones from downriver." The vendor slid out a volume, flourishes and facades engraved so precisely you could cut your finger on a line. Brackets, moldings, entry surrounds, a whole avenue in embryo. Architecture had learned to travel by page and crate. Entire facades, iron-boned, were sold like songs. Verses repeatable by any band with the right instruments. I followed the man with the portfolio into a narrower street where the buildings changed mood. Here the brownstone made way for brick and more brick, for stairways pulled inside, for windows paired like sore eyes. The air shaft between buildings sliced daylight into a thin blade and called itself health. A woman leaned out from a fourth-floor window, wrung a cloth, and watched a cart of ice belly up to the curb. A boy hammered sheet metal into a duct while his brother tried not to cough. On a fire escape, the newest lace in the city's wardrobe, two girls sat with their feet on the grating, learning the alphabet of the street below. Tenement and parlor house, two melodies in counterpoint. The same city, different tempo. Even here the arch taught its lesson, only in steel, lintels and stair runs taking each other's weight, landing to landing, as if gravity and will had signed a modest treaty. The watch tugged at my pulse. Its little drawn arch had a second meaning ready, and so I let the street exchange itself for another. Stone rose from water in a cadence of spans, a bridge shouldering the sky, its repeated arches stepping across a river that looked wider than sense. On a scaffolding that seemed made of forest, men in wool coats and caps moved with a cautious rhythm, each part of a machine that had learned to breathe. Down below, barges drifted like forgotten thoughts. Up on the deck, a man in a black coat folded his hands behind him and watched the masonry, his eyes the exact gray of November. An engineer, they are a breed that recognizes itself, even across time. "You build with force," I said, "but you're really composing with trust." He turned, amused. "Trust is a force," he said. "We teach stones to lean on one another and not be ashamed of it." He led me along the staging to an almost made arch, its ribs of temporary timber held together like clasped fingers. Between the ashlar blocks, a gap yawned where the keystone would go. "You see," he said, tapping a wedge with his hammer's wooden cheek. "Each stone pushes. Alone, that is disaster. Together, that is holding." "Like a city," I said. "Like a city," he agreed, and the river gave us a single large nod. When the keystone slid into its bed, it made a noise not unlike a sentence ending well. We went down to the river where the bridge's reflection learned itself in pieces. A boy filled a pail from a public fountain and did not stop to marvel at the miracle of clean water in a cup, which meant the miracle had already succeeded. Far off, eastward, a line of stone arches marched across another valley, the aqueduct feeding the city's thirst not with wine but with memory, the taste of hills, the discipline of gravity, the decency of pressure. The city had pulled a river out of the countryside and run it through pipes above its own head, and then said, with civic modesty, "Drink." "Your arches carry more than people in carts," I said to the engineer. "Yes," he said. "They carry the idea that tomorrow will be less afraid." He gave me a look I could not quite place. "You are not a reporter," he said, "but you are reporting to someone." "To myself," I said. "That will do," he answered, and the bridge sailed off without us. I stepped back downtown, pulled by the sound of hammer on iron. In a district where the streets were tight and the sky willing, facades of cast iron stood in polished repetition, columns wearing Corinthian leaves that had never seen a living vine, arches repeating across second stories, spandrels punched with medallions. A foundryman in a leather apron wiped his hands and showed me a pattern, a wooden negative of a bracket, more beautiful than the thing it promised to become. "Wood to sand, sand to iron, iron to street," he said. "A city is a foundry of patience." "People say cast iron is a cheat," I tried, because people always say something. "It is a confession," he said. "We confess we want stone's dignity and glass's hunger. Iron lets us have both and not go bankrupt." He laughed, a soot-dry sound. "And if a man buys 2 more windows for his floor, is that sin?" "Ask light." Light answered. It flowed through bigger panes than stone alone would permit. Inside a warehouse, bolts of cloth shone like quiet flags. A seamstress looked up from her machine, and the thread of sun ran along the line of her cheekbone. Afternoons here had a sweetness particular to iron, a faint hot smell, a faint cling in the throat. The knowledge that every bolt head visible on a facade was a handshake you could count on. Fire was the stern god of the district. It was kept, mostly by watchmen with lanterns, and by a calmness born of doing the same thing correctly 1,000 days in a row. At the edge of Washington Square, a white ghost had materialized, an arch so pale it seemed temporary, a promise in plaster tracing a future line. A crowd practiced the art of pretending not to stare. Children ran its circle as if it were a coin they could spend. A pianist in the open air found a tune large enough to fit underneath. An old mason sat on a crate near the base, his hand slow with dignity. He watched nothing and saw everything. "Arches again," I said. "They are the city's eyelids," he said. Open and shut, without which you dry up or drown." "Does this one belong?" I asked, thinking of the houses around, of the dignified stoops and the quiet taxicabs of trees. He tilted his head. "It belongs the way a memory belongs. It looks backward and forward at the same time. That is the only honest direction." On a nearby stoop, 3 women stitched their day together, Irish, German, colored, trading recipes for cabbage and childcare, and which landlord would fix a cracked step without being asked twice. A boy drew with chalk a house too tall for any human life, and his sister added a ladder reaching into the scribbled sky. A policeman with heroic whiskers failed to chase a vendor who whose cart rang with pale green bottles. A breeze pushed through the square, and the arch accepted it like a bow. I thought of Klaas's knee braces and the engineer's keystones, joints and wedges, meetings and leanings. The city was teaching me its grammar. A door is a promise, an arch is a pact, a stoop is a sentence half in the house's voice, half in the streets. The watch warmed in my pocket. I drew it out and balanced it on my fingertips. On the little dial, the drawn arch glowed with the reflected light of the square. Beyond it, another symbol waited, a small tower with toy battlements, a hint of teeth against the sky. Courage, the watch said without saying anything. I looked north. Past the square, a spire cut the light with unembarrassed certainty. Farther still, a tower rose with the stubborn poetry of fortifications, brick bristling into crenels the way a cat makes fur of its back when the world grows too loud. Somewhere between worship and war, between prayer and parade, the city had learned to give itself towers and call them home. "What comes next?" said the woman with the apron, who had finished her stoop and now rested her chin on the topmost rail, watching the square like a theater. "Height," I said, and didn't add fear because sometimes they are the same word. "Then keep your hat," she advised, and went back inside, her door closing with the polite authority only a well-hung door knows. I held the watch near my ear. Its whisper had acquired an edge, the way a song picks up brass when it prepares for the chorus. The hand slipped forward. The arch on the dial passed into the memory of arches. The little tower with its crisp notches took pride of place. Around me the street thickened with a new urge, not merely to span or to shelter, but to declare. Stone learning to talk like a bell, brick gathering itself into shouldered courage, iron offering ribs to carry a future that was suddenly heavier. I stepped from the square into a wind that had come from a bridge and a church and an armory all at once, and the air tasted like rivets and prayer. Above, a tower waited, older than the skyscraper's hunger, newer than the palisade's fear, ready to teach me what it means to lean not just inward, stone to stone, but upward, century to century, until the sky itself remembers to answer